civilization. And this is connected with Teilhard de Chardin's doctrine of peduncles. Peduncles aren't exactly relatives. And we have to understand first the doctrine of peduncles. Now, here it is. Here is a globule. It might be an amoeba, or it might be oil in water suspended. And this globule is going to separate. First it does this.
Just read what you wrote back there.
Then it does this.
She's got eczema. She a dandruff queen now.
Then it does this.
She a dandruff sufferer.
And then it does this. See? Now, these things here are peduncles. From the Latin root pes, pedis, being a foot. Some sort of protrusion out of a globular body. So notice then that the production of a peduncle, here in the form of a connecting neck, and here in the form of little tails when the neck is broken, that in the course of the development, when we reach this stage, the peduncles have disappeared. According to de Chardin, this is why we do not find missing links around in the evolutionary process. They vanished in accordance with the law of peduncles. Now, in exactly the same way, the human technology sets up certain kinds of peduncles. A road, for example, or a railroad is a peduncle, because with the development of automotive traffic, truck traffic, the railroads become increasingly obsolete. And there are rusty old tracks lying all over the country that are not used anymore. And then with the development of aircraft, the road tends to become obsolete. With the development of radio, the wire as a connection, as a peduncle, becomes obsolete. So that more and more, the connecting links that we saw in a visible way disappear with the development of more expert types of communication. We can easily take this a step further. When we develop a form of electronic communication, such that you don't even need to take a plane. You want to see, supposing I want to see my father in England, we both have these laser beam TV jobs, and just like that, I can recreate in front of him myself and my exact environment, everything around, just as if he was sitting in the room. And I can do that with his set on the other end. So that eventually we don't need to take the plane. You can conceive, as some science fiction writers have, what seems to us a rather appalling situation, where you never need to leave the place where you're sitting. All food supplies and everything are automatically delivered. You just dial what you want, and some kind of mechanical process transmits it to you. Then they go further than that. They don't. They really abolish food altogether, because they've got it down to some special essences which you take. Then they go beyond that, and you give yourself a certain kind of electronic stimulation, and it does all for you that food could ever do. And then you think, oh dear, what's the next step beyond that? Of course. The next step beyond that is, of course, there's one thing yet, one peduncle we have to get rid of. And that is the black box, the electronic gadget. Because by the time we have become as etherealized as that, we move into telepathy and psychic communication. And as soon as you make that step, of course, it would seem that all privacy whatsoever has gone. Because what you are inside is an open book to everybody else. Your thoughts are easily read. And therefore, you may say at first, ooh, that is the conversion of humanity into an anthill. of the worst type. And this is, in a way, naturally, what all properly educated Americans, and I will add properly educated Britishers, and some other peoples, dread. It is said the Englishman's home is his castle. And everybody needs a castle, a place where you can get away from it all, and just be yourself. But even then, when you're away from it all and you're just being in yourself, you've unfortunately got a lot of thoughts inside your head that aren't yours. Because you think in the English language, and that was given to you by other people, and contains their prejudices, that you can't avoid them in thinking. Japanese people will say that when they think in Japanese, they can have certain feelings that are characteristically Japanese. But when they start thinking in English, they can't have those feelings. And so you are very, very much really in the sphere of public influence when you start to think. And if you listen carefully to your thoughts, insofar as they are uttered in words, and they very often are, try and discover the tone of voice in which certain of your thoughts are being said, and you will listen and hear your mother, or you will hear an aunt, or you will hear a school teacher, or you will hear certain friends expressing their opinions and telling you who you are and how you ought to behave. And you think those are your thoughts, and they're nothing of the kind. An inner pandemonium under the dome of the skull is going on all the time. Myriads of voices, myriads of influences from outside working upon you, even when you are physically quite alone. So, this means that you are not nearly as much of a private individual as you think. You are also, of course, exercising these influences upon other people. You're telling them who they are, what you think about them, what you think of their behavior. And even if they don't believe you, they nevertheless pay very serious attention to it. They can't help it. You can take the experiment, for example, that B.F. Skinner used to try, which is very terrifying. He would send two members of the class selected arbitrarily outside of the room. Then he would arrange two chairs, chair A and chair B. He would say to the class, now look, when these people come back, we're going to engage them in a conversation. Whatever A says, agree with him. Whatever B says, disagree with him. So they come back into the room and they take their seats and the conversation begins. Now B may be a very strong-headed, articulate person, and A really rather feeble. But what happens is this, that by group agreement with anything A says, he is encouraged, he is built up, he becomes more articulate, he finds himself sprouting. But B, by being disagreed with on every point, begins to get baffled and confused and feel very uncomfortable indeed. Unless he is onto the game, and he challenges the whole group, I see now what you're playing. You have made up your minds to disagree with everything I say. Therefore, of course, you don't count. I shall pay no attention to you. So, in this way, you see, we're already colossally influenced by each other. And this is why I think that Harry Stack Sullivan's basic ideas about psychopathology are in some respects more profound than Freud's. Freud is always looking into the individual history, into the physiology, into the depth psychology of the individual in an interior sort of way. But Sullivan was always looking to the individual as the expression of a social network. And the same in the psychology of George Herbert Mead, where he called the conceptions that we have of ourselves the interiorized other. In other words, the sum total of all the things that people have told us we are. Because you do not know yourself as a self, except in a society. Just as you do not exist biologically without a father and a mother, you do not carry on an existence without a society, and the reactions of other people to you provide you with the mirror in which you attain a realization of yourself. You know who you are in terms of your relationships with others. So then now, when we contemplate this disappearance of privacy and a completely integrated human society, we can look at this from two different points of view, pro and con. Let us first look at the pro point of view. How great to have nothing to hide. How great to give up all worries about ownership. Because you can say, if somebody says they would like something you have, and you say, please, have it. Because you know very well you can go to someone else and say, could I have that? And they'll give it to you. And so all the way around, there is no propriety, in the sense not of prudish propriety, but propriety in the sense of possession. Also, of course, in the sense of prudish propriety. Nobody has any dirty little secrets, because if I have any dirty secrets, I know very well that you have too, and so let's drop the whole pretense and let go. So in this sense, there might be a very, very close fellowship between all people, in which there are no barriers, no defenses, and we all cooperate together beautifully and love each other. Now, let's look at the con point of view. Con point of view would say, yes, but surely, the more we communicate with each other in that way and have no property, and there are no boundaries, and there are no fences or defenses, then, just in the same way that jet aircraft makes all cities the same city, so this would make all people the same individual. Would that be what the Hindus mean by saying you are all one, you are all the Godhead in disguise? Would it mean that? Now, part of our difficulty in approaching this is that we begin from the standpoint of a certain conception of the individual person. And this is, of course, the Christian ego, which is the soul as a center of action and something alive with consciousness and intelligence that lies hidden in the bag of skin. As, for example, King John says in Shakespeare's play to Hubert, within this wall of flesh there is a soul counts thee her creditor, and with advantage means to pay thy love. See the image? Within this wall of flesh there is a soul. Within the castle there is the king. And every man's home is his castle. And so those of us who are brought up in that way, to feel A, that we are basically the soul in the body, and B, that every soul that exists is of infinite value in the eyes of God. We therefore have instituted, since the Industrial Revolution, a tremendous technological campaign to preserve the individual. We have all kinds of social services, hospitals, ambulances, medicine, welfare agencies, every kind of thing, with the one aim of preserving life, getting you to live longer, and giving what is called full opportunity for the development of your personality. To the myriads of Asia, this is almost unbelievable. And then, of course, we are teaching the peoples of Asia medicine and sanitation, industrialization, so that every single child can be regarded not as so much waste human material, which because it's sick has to be thrown away, but as some individual to be loved and cherished and properly treated. And because individuality, the human, each particular human organism is infinitely precious. That is the moving ideal of the sort of people who first created the great hospitals, who abolished slavery, who abolished the death penalty for trivial offenses, who made that great humanitarian movement of the 19th century associated with such people as Wesley and Charles Dickens and Wilberforce and so on, to rescue the precious individual from the ravages of impersonal disease or impersonal political exploitation. Then, when a kind of American capitalist liberalism achieved to some extent this sort of ideal, we look then at political forms which are socialistic or communistic and are leery of them because they seem to go back on all that. So, of course, did National Socialism in Germany. Because the position there is, it is not the individual who is the supremely important being, but it is the community, the state, which is supremely important. The individual realizes himself as a servant of the state. But our theory in the liberal capitalism of the United States is that the state is the servant of the individual. That we employ policemen and soldiers and sanitary inspectors and Department of Commerce officials, all to serve us. We call them public servants. And when a policeman gets uppish, he has to be reminded that we pay his salary and that his job is to serve us and not to be a kind of Admirable Crichton sort of butler who takes the upper hand. But of course, the very idea of a servant still has in it, doesn't it, something aristocratic. And as we all know, in this country, it is increasingly difficult to get services of any kind. More and more, it is felt beneath the individual's dignity to be, say, a waiter, a barber. After all, they give you a certain kind of service. Certainly, it's beneath anyone's dignity to shine shoes, because that's the feet, and that's very low down. That's like kissing people's feet. To give massage, to do all these things for other people that are rather material skills. Increasingly, you have to get them in another way, either by a do-it-yourself system or by some sort of machinery. And so in the same way, people who used to give service want to translate themselves professionally. People who were formerly called undertakers now call themselves morticians. Janitors call themselves maintenance services. I suppose barbers will soon call themselves tonsorial experts. All sorts of things like that are happening right now in order to give the sense of equality all round. And so the guy who gives you gas at the garage will notice your first name on your credit card and will address you by it. I get very irritated to be called Al. I just don't respond to that form of address at all. But I suppose that's my British snobbishness. But here it is, everybody slaps everybody's back. Now, I was very puzzled by this when I first came to live in California, because here the use of first names and this kind of familiarity is extraordinarily common. And when I found myself on first name terms with a man who was in a certain sense my boss, who was the president of the University of the Pacific, I felt distinctly uncomfortable. And the reason I felt uncomfortable was that I felt the whole thing was insincere. That there was not the kind of relationship between us which would normally be represented by being on first name terms. But there was what was much worse, and sort of effort to prove that there really ought to be that kind of relationship when neither side had any intention of forming it. And that's very baffling if you come from outside. And you don't know, I suppose, what all good born and bred Californians know. What are the cues? The subliminal cues which distinguish one form of first name address from another. Of course, what eventually happens is that people have two first names. The published one and the nickname known only to an intimate circle. Used only by an intimate circle. But you see, what we see in this then is the creeping socialism, the creeping abolition of what is precious and what is private and what is property. And feel that as that disappears, and as all fences disappear, the collection of human beings will simply dissolve into an amorphous mass. And indeed, there is a danger of that. We have seen people disappear into amorphous masses. We have seen Hitler's legions. We have seen the things that Chinese can do with what the military tactic called the human sea, when swarms and swarms of troops, all identically uniformed, are absolutely thrown at the enemy in wave after wave after wave. But let us not forget that the generals of the Western powers did exactly the same thing in the First World War. On both sides, they used the tactics of the human sea, in which the lives of individuals meant nothing whatsoever. Now, there are two different ways of responding to what we will call the invasion of privacy. Very often you will encounter someone who attacks your privacy in a psychological way. It may be a drunk sitting next to you at a bar. Or it may be someone who fancies himself as an expert psychological guru. And when you express an opinion, or say, you walk up to such an individual and say, "Good morning. How are you feeling?" He says, "Why do you ask me?" And he immediately, you see, breaks the social rules whereby you communicate with another person without actually saying anything. Phrases like, "How are you? Nice day, isn't it?" are like on a radio, buzzing to be sure that the other side is in communication. And so you make various noises, testing, is that so-and-so, give a call letter, etc., 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 and you know you're in touch. So in the same way, we, in our general daily converse, we feel each other out by saying these little social platitudes. And then we test the person as to whether they, by the sound of the voice, by the smell, which we don't think about, but which we absorb unconsciously, unless they smell very strong. Then complete with bombs. And then we get the feeling, do I want to explore this relationship further? We test. But then those people, you see, who invade your privacy instantly, it's either the drunk, or the child who is quite innocent, or the probing psychologist who is playing his special game, maybe of one-upmanship of some kind, and sees how uncomfortable he can make you. Now, what are the tactics of response to be in these various situations? When you get the probing psychologist, you can shrug your shoulders and say, "Didn't your mother ever teach you manners?" Or you can simply not defend yourself. Some people just don't need to defend themselves at all. And so that probing them in that way is like tossing a rock into a well, and you wait, and there's no splash. And that really sets people back. Krishnamurti does that. If you make a comment about somebody in his presence that is in any way adverse or critical, he gives us no response at all. So if you suddenly feel, like the Buddha said, you spat at the sky and the spit falls back into your own face. And I was once present where a certain person of that nature was using as his ploy silence. And the silence implied the conversation of everyone else around this table is trivial. And it was one of those tangible silences. And suddenly someone at the table turned to him and said, "You know, I can't stand people who use silence as a weapon." No, the conversation then started. But, and it was a very, rather a disagreeable conversation, if I may say so. So, there is, you see, always the response to psychological attack and invasion of privacy, as Allen Ginsberg does it. If anybody presses on him too hard, he'll strip naked. And if anybody challenges him to fight, he said, "All right, you challenge me, I choose the weapons. Who's going to undress first?" And he has this kind of marvelous feeling that there really isn't anything that he's hiding. I don't know, there may be, but he certainly doesn't impress me as anyone who really hides anything. So that you see, to enter into a human relationship where there is nothing to hide and you don't depend on any sort of property gimmick for your personal worth. Okay, that's the thing we get very easily hooked on. It may be your car, it may be your clothes, it may be your cameras, your style of watches, your fountain pens, your heaven only knows what, your home that you possess. And that is inseparable from your personality. And you can't be you if you're stark naked. So the confrontation of people in an atmosphere of physical or spiritual nakedness is one where many individuals seem they have completely lost because they can't play their accustomed role. Because I have a certain advantage, and even if I'm stark naked, I can still talk. But now, supposing they say now, "You shut up." Don't defend yourself with language, see? Yes. That's like taking off an extra set of clothes. But as I say, there's a certain kind of individual whom this doesn't faze at all. Because he knew from the beginning that he was nothing. And nobody. And of course that's a very important thing to know. Because you have nothing to lose. He who sleeps on the floor will not fall out of bed. And he who has nothing to lose has really no fear, either of the loss of his property, his propriety, or his privacy. But there are other people who, in this situation of the loss of privacy, are completely degraded. The way, for example, we systematically deprive privacy from the intimate inmates of prisons and mental hospitals. You go into a mental hospital, all the Johns are completely exposed. Everything is smooth walls. There are no corners, there are no secrets. Everybody's sort of herded around and they all look the same, put the same uniform, have the same haircut, and also in the army, in the Marine boot camps. The first thing is to degrade the individual ritually so that he has no privacy. And see what happens to him if you do that. Now you may, the result of this is that you may brainwash him completely and make him nothing more than an obedient tool of the system. And in this case, you see what you've got. You're back again to monarchical politics. And so in a system where the design of the politics is that the community of human beings is ruled whether by an individual monarch or by a totalitarian state, makes no difference. But the dynamics of that situation is that this community is not a group, it is a crowd. Now we therefore have to understand the difference between a group and a crowd. Because this is the key to the whole thing, and if you understand this, you can get round the things that seem threatening in a society where there is no privacy. A crowd is structured in this way. There is a number of identical individuals, suitably brainwashed, and there is a leader. Whether this is an individual again, or a bureaucratic entity of some kind. The relationship between them is this. In other words, the line of communication is from the individual to the leader. And they're not really in communication with each other at all. Except insofar they may communicate with each other, but this controls the nature of their communication. So in other words, when a politician speaks to an enormous audience, what he sets up is a crowd. Because the audience are individuals who don't know each other. They're just people, they're just heads or hands. And so the leader really communicates with them, and they can't answer back. Unless they do so as a group. See, Kyle! You know? Then they answer back. But all as a collective. Because along the lines of this kind of communication, supposing I talk to 1,000 people over the radio, and they all send me back letters. Well, I can't read them, much less answer them. There isn't time. So this is a strictly one-way communication. Now then, let's look in contrast to that with the design of a group. We'll make it a circle again for convenience. Now, a group has no leader, because it is itself an organism, and so the lines of communication run first of all like this. Well, this isn't very well drawn, because I've got an odd number in it, but that's all right. But they're much more complicated than that. They're also this. Now you see what's going on. Let's go this one around. Who isn't he talking to here? He isn't talking to that one. He isn't talking to this one. He isn't talking to this one. You see how, I'm not going to draw this at all, it'll take forever. But the thing is that this sort of pattern is group communication. This sort of pattern is crowd communication. So an effective group, a true group of human beings, is one in which there are enough people, or not too many people, so that they can all know each other and are in communication with each other. Now then you say, how do you relate that sort of a cell to the larger human group? Why, very simply. Every group appoints one cell to represent it. And that cell goes and joins a group of representative cells. And they have to be of adequate size for them all to be in touch with each other. And if it's necessary to go higher than that and include a greater number of collectivity of small cells, the representative group, representative sub 1, will elect representative sub 2 to go to a representative group of sub 2s. And in this method, which is the actual original design of the Republic of the United States, which of course has been completely overlooked, you get a hierarchy of cell structures where because I am in communication with you here, and I'm fully occupied in this system of communication, the chances are that I don't know a great deal about what other cell groups are doing because it's too complicated for me to scan. But therefore, we will delegate one particular individual and say, you make a specialty of scanning these other groups around here so that you have a wider knowledge. And so it goes, so that you have a hierarchical system of communication. You can call it government if you want to, because what we are simply talking about is an information system. So that, for example, one of these will not ever individually elect the President of the United States, but his representative at a certain level will, because his representative at a certain level knows far more about who to select than he does, because he's made it his business to do so. Every individual can't do that. And so you will find that this is the system of direct representation used by all dictators. All dictators vote themselves into office by referendum. They take it to the people. They say, you are the people, you elect me. Well, it's the easiest thing in the world to bamboozle an enormous number of people by mass persuasion to do practically anything you want. But you can't bamboozle that kind of structure. It's too strong. Here, with the mass communication, you see everybody getting the same thing. Now, oddly enough, you see, McLuhan, in his thought about the future of communications, says that with the development of the electronic circuits, we tend towards tribalism. And this precisely is tribalism. This is the monolithic state. This is the tribal community. This is utterly paternalistic, but this is different. This gives everybody a chance to have his say-so. And have his say-so not only in terms of a yes or no vote, but the thing, the unit, the tribe is small enough for there to be a discussion. And that's why we can't understand about Indians, Amerindians, why they don't like the idea of voting. They have a powwow. They're like Quakers. The Quakers don't vote. They get what they call a sense of the meeting. Because they all know each other, and they consider putting a thing to a vote as a kind of unreasonable procedure. We should all get together and feel it out and establish through discussion a consensus. So this, as I say, is a very strong human cluster, very difficult to be pushed around by this. Now, as we have developed electronic communications thus far, we have things like great national hookups. So everybody in the United States is watching whatever it is that comes over ABC or NBC at the major hours. And but that is, I think, a fairly temporary phenomenon. With the development of UHF, ultra-high frequency television broadcasting, and the more we develop microelectric machinery, the greater the capacity for discrimination on the dial. See, as it is, you get a lot of interference, and therefore it cuts out the possibility of an innumerable cluster of stations. But as the technology becomes more perfect, you can receive an enormous number of different stations. And these stations will increasingly have machinery that makes them fairly simple to run. For example, with a videotape machine now made by Ampex costing $6,000 and a Sony television camera costing $250. You can produce a television show with only one technician. The average TV show produced in a studio requires 14 technicians to handle it. So as this happens, you see, it means that there can be an increasing variety of the kind of material that is presented through the electronic channels. And McLuhan adds to this a kind of strange point of view, which is that it really doesn't matter what kind of material is going over, because the message is not the content of the television show, but your exposure to and involvement in that kind of a medium. Well, there's something to this. That when you touch a person physically, which is a sort of a direct communication, you don't necessarily say anything. It is just the act of touching that may give the message or the massage of affection or love. And so people love to wander into the streets and mingle with a crowd of shoppers, especially a colorful crowd going back and forth, and the feeling of all the interesting people around and everything. Not saying anything to each other in words, but this exciting feeling of being involved in this colorful goings-on. And so in the same way, when we are plugged in, if not turned on, to a huge in and outing of human communication, we feel very like an old Italian peasant lady leaning on the windowsill and gazing at the busy street, watching life flow by. And in a way, you see, there's something, when you see it in terms of the old Italian mama watching the world go by, there's something very fundamentally good about that. Something we associate with colorful villages, exciting streets, and the romance of an archaic peasant-type person. But you see that sort of thing, of watching an ever-varying panorama of life, is not completely excluded by electronic technology. Especially if people in their net structure are organized here as true nets. This is not a true net. This is just a trap. Well, let's take an intermission. I was discussing the plausibility of two essential features of the philosophy of illusion. The question that we have to decide whether to take life seriously or not, that is to say, whether the plot is comic or tragic. And if it's tragic, you see, must we say that it's ultimately tragic? And the question of who are you? And are we to say that I myself, right down at root, am just a little kind of jerk of some kind that really has nothing to do with this cosmos, but just arises in it and is here on sufferance for a short period, and then absolutely nothing follows, you see. Or the alternative to that is what I really am, the same as the whole thing, that is, the works, the it, or whatever you want to call it, Brahman, God, the Tao, the great void, the Buddha nature, I don't care, the self, anything, any name you want. And whereas that attitude, you can look at it from various points of view in judging it. You can say it's wishful thinking. You can say that it's insufferable pride. But the point of the matter is, as I tried to show, any other way of looking at things is kind of schizoid. It looks at human beings as if they arrived in this world like a bunch of birds on the branches of a barren tree. And they just got settled there, you know, they don't belong. The sense of being strangers and pilgrims from another domain altogether. Well, where is this other domain? And how does it relate to this one? Are they separate? I showed you that even when we say that two domains are the poles apart, the very fact that they're poles shows that they have a hidden connection. And the hidden connection is the big thing in life. All you junkies know that. And so, in other words, we get a pattern of organization that is radial rather than an assemblage, as if the universe were really a multiverse. A lot of things that got collected together out of the infinite wastes of space and sort of began to maunder around each other. Whereas the other pattern, which is so much more sensible, is central and radial. And I showed you how the crystals and the stars and the octopuses and even the human beings are all radial structures. Of course, we don't see our radial relationship to the totality of the universe because it isn't obvious. It's obvious that a tree is an arm of the earth reaching up and waving at the sky. And a mountain is another kind of radiation from the earth. And so is a leg from a body, and hair, and things like that. But what makes human beings, as the highest of the mammals, so conscious of being independent, is that they are topologically an enclosed surface, you see, which wanders around independently of the ground. What we don't notice is that we are not independent of the ground at all. That wandering around is something that is entirely related to there being some ground. In other words, when you run up a hill, the hill also runs you up it. The hill rises and lifts you as you run, you see? And if you understand that, you don't take a hostile attitude to mountains and hills. You're grateful to them for lifting you up so high in the air, because that's presumably why you went up, that the thing was high. It was lifted up. You wanted to be lifted up. It lifted you up. You had to cooperate, of course. I always like the illustration that I've used before, perhaps you haven't heard it, of the thistledown. The thistledown, too, comes moving through the sky. I once was playing with the thing, you know, and this came out of the blue sky, and I caught it like that, pulled it under my nose, and it started to pull to get away, see? It looks as if it were a butterfly or something that pulls away when you catch it by the leg. And I thought, oh no, of course, that's not the thistledown, it's the wind. Well, which was it? You know, in a famous debate that was settled by the sixth patriarch of Zen, there were two monks arguing when a flag was flapping in the wind, whether it was the wind or the flag that was moving. And he said, it's neither, it's the mind. And so in a way, the same thing was true about the thistledown. The mind is the moving thing, because which point of view will you take? Which attitude of mind will you take towards this? Is it the wind moving the thistledown? Or is it the thistledown that is moving itself with the wind? After all, when you see a sailing boat, and there's a man in the sailing boat, who is moving the boat? Is it the wind moving the boat, or is it the man moving the boat because he was smart enough to put up a sail? Much smarter way of getting around than rowing. You don't have to work. It's intelligence, you see, the mind that moves the boat. And so in the same way, I thought, this thistledown has some kind of intelligence. It's radio, it's organized, it's beautiful. And it's used that to sail itself with the wind, to enable itself to pull like a little organism playing with the wind. And so in just the same way, each one of us uses the universe to get around. And the universe uses us to play with and to make games and patterns and to do its stuff. So because we seem to be disconnected and entirely sealed within our skin, that is a very deceptive thing, because the skin is not really the boundary of man. You will notice that in various periods of art, human beings have been shaped in different ways. And have been more or less transparent at some times, at other times opaque, and sometimes the emphasis has been on the state of mind which this human being is in. At other times the emphasis is on the bodily conformations and so on. In the work of painters today, one sees images that at first sight one doesn't recognize as being human. There was an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York some years ago called The New Image of Man. And these things didn't look like human beings at all. Some of them did, but that's because what does a human being look like? That depends on your point of view. You see, if you are prejudiced that a human being is only what is inside his skin, then you think that when anybody paints the human being beyond those boundaries, that he's lost the image of man. He hasn't necessarily lost it at all. You see, there's an old feeling that the shape of the universe is the shape of man. I don't know if you've ever heard that said. That man is the microcosm, and that the universe as a whole is the macrocosm. Now, as you plumb out into the universe and explore it astronomically, it gets very strange. You begin to see things in the depths that at first sight seem utterly remote. How could they have anything to do with us? They are so far off and so unlikely. And in the same way, when you start probing into the inner workings of the human body, you come across all kinds of funny little monsters and wiggly things that bear no resemblance to what we recognize as the human image. If you feel your own pulse, or if you're able to look at an X-ray in some way of your inner organs working, see, they're all strangers to us. We don't know about them. And they give us the creeps, as if they were, coming across some weird insects in the dark. And that sort of feeling. But what we will always find out in the end, you see, when we meet the very strange thing, and we look into the distant reaches of space, there will one day be the dawning recognition, that's me. Why, that's me. And the whole game of the universe, you see, is to appear as strange to itself as it possibly can. That's how one keeps variety going. That's how one keeps wonder going. And all kinds of exciting developments. How different can you get? In the beginning, the Lord said, get lost to himself, you see. So, we shall find, for example, that space that you see all around you and containing you. And you can feel space in many ways. Space is not only something that comes through the eyes, the movement of your arms, if with closed eyes, for a blind person, is his way of knowing space. And you can hear space audibly. Lots of sounds appear to be in restricted spaces or ample spaces. And silence that goes with sound corresponds to space. And even St. Thomas Aquinas, that old Catholic theologian, said that good derives its virtue from evil, just as it is the silent pause that gives sweetness to the chant. So, but space, you see, that seems to contain. Space is one's mind. This was common sense to people living in the early Renaissance, for example, at the time of Dante. There are many references in Dante's poetry to the identity of mind and space. And likewise in a 8th century text in China, the Sutra of the Sixth Patriarch, he likens the nature of mind to the nature of space. He says just as space contains all the sun and the moon and the stars and the people and the mountains and the forests, so the nature of mind, the nature of consciousness, the nature of oneself contains all these things. So you see that if you think that way, you have an image of man that is global, that is very different from the image in which man is defined as bounded by his skin. That's a prejudice. We think now, for example, I have my own private thoughts. Well, nobody has private thoughts. Because one thinks in images and words, and these words and images are derived from the whole thought structure of the society in which you live. We think thoughts. The domain of mind is very similar to the grid structure of an electric power supply system. You know, what happens is there's a network of power stations and transformers so arranged that if one of them gives out and fails to supply a certain area, immediately the grid connects them with other sources of power. Well, in rather a similar way, our minds are connected. Let's take one very obvious example of it. What Northrop Frye calls the order of words. The order of words is all existing literature. Both rhetoric, what is spoken, of course, and what is written down. Now, it's his theory that as a scholar of literature, the history of literature, he can take any piece of writing of a reasonable length and tell you when it was written. Because everything that is written and said is inescapably related to the whole order of words. And it's amazing what little things you might not notice will give you away. Because he can say, well, obviously he has read this, thinking, say, of a particular novelist or poet. So it must come after the date when that novel was published. But he couldn't possibly use an expression like that to say, for example, that it was a capital day. He would never use that expression, living, say, in contemporary 20th century America. That's a Victorianism, or it's an Edwardian way of talking. And so by all sorts of little clues like that, the scholar can pin down a piece of writing to when it was written, you see. That is because every individual piece of writing is a function of all writing that's being done. Well, now that's a very specific and almost crude illustration of something that's going on in a far more complicated way than that. It isn't only all writing, all thinking is being done in relation to the total order of thought. And in a still more subtle way, all living is being done in relation to the total order of life, to what de Chardin calls the biosphere, and it goes way beyond that, because of the vast interplay of what we now call gravitational and electrical fields, which embrace everything that there is. That is why the ancients, when a person was born, cast his horoscope. That was a map of the universe at the time of that person's birth. And therefore it was a drawing of his soul. Because the soul is not inside the body. The body is inside the soul. The soul, your soul, is the whole universe as it is focused upon your organism. Now, of course, astrology is a very primitive science, and it interpreted the influence of the universe upon the individual in very crude ways, and it works mostly by good guesswork on the part of the astrologer. If you know how to tell fortunes at a fair, you will find out a great deal about how all these predictive psychic sciences work, because the client invariably gives himself away. Either by his anxiety to be told the truth, or by his anxiety to conceal it. They work equally well. Now, but there is, you see, underneath the astrological notion, a sound idea that the true map of the soul is the picture of the universe surrounding the individual. It isn't necessarily your soul is not the picture of the universe that's the moment that you're born. You see, it goes along all the time you live, because the whole thing expresses itself through you. And therefore, in that sense, the map of the stars, the horoscope, etc., was an image of man in just the same way as we regard a picture of the human body as an image of man, and it's an image from a different point of view. It's a bigger image. It shows, in other words, that your mind is very largely outside your body. After all, it's inside too, it's simultaneous. You see, I cannot think, I can't have a mind without seeing, feeling, and relating to other people. Without all the social institutions, not only language, but the laws, the customs, the gestures, the rituals by which we relate to each other, all those things compose the mind. For the mind is a huge network of relationships and interconnections at a high level of sensitivity. Mind and matter are, of course, polar. They go together. There are two ways of thinking about the same thing, or shall we say two dimensions of the same thing, just like length and breadth, or just, shall we say, like shape and color. You see, nobody ever saw a shape that wasn't colored. Nobody ever saw a color that wasn't shaped. And yet we can see there's a very clear difference between color and shape. But they always go together, they're always bound together. Well, that's the same sort of relationship between mind and matter. Now, the difficulty that people have in trying to reduce one to the other, and saying, well, the world is only material, or saying, on the other hand, that it's only mental, is the same difference you would have in trying to reduce all shapes to colors, colors to shapes. So perfectly, and yet stay so marvelously different. That's why the Buddhists say, difference is identity. Identity is difference. It sounds goofy, but it makes a great deal of sense, because what it's saying is a relational thing. That you don't know what identity is unless you know what difference is, and you don't know what difference is unless you know what identity is. That relationship between so-called opposites is called in the Chinese technical Taoist vocabulary, mutual arising. So they say to be and not to be arise mutually. High and low are mutually posited. Long and short are mutually delineated, and so on. Now, what we see then is the totality of the cosmos focused at each point, you see, gives rise to the illusion of the independence of the point from the whole. Just as the human being, by virtue of having an enclosed epidermis, and to be able to walk instead of having to be rooted to the ground, presents the illusion of being separate. And so that's why I asked Vada to do these demonstrations last night, because he showed visually the interdependence of the figure and the background, and how the two play together, how you can switch from paying attention to one to paying attention to the other, and in each case it's significant. But that is an art that we have lost in our day-to-day perception of life, and it leads, practically speaking, to the serious problem of ecological blindness. That is to say, to the ignorance which most human beings seem to suffer from, especially in our culture, that they are inseparably related to their physical environment. It looks as if we aren't. It looks as if we can go out with bulldozers and insecticides and every kind of a gadget and make over our physical environment as it suits our whims. But then we discover to our consternation that we've upset all sorts of balances. That the house we made such a nice flat lot for on the hillside suddenly slides down the hill when there's a rainstorm because we took away all the shrubbery that was binding the hill together. And you know, this happens in Hollywood every day. And and nobody ever seems to learn. And that's, you see, this immense importance of overcoming the illusion of separateness. But people are afraid of that because they think it's communistic. They think that the grand style, the great thing about Western civilization, is its stress on individual personality and its value. And that we have created the ideal of personal integrity. That is to say that the most important thing in the world is the individual. All collectivities, corporations, states, and so on, exist as servants of the individual. And if they get in his way and they interfere with his private enterprise, whatever that may be, it's a bad thing. Man, the individual, is the crown of creation from this point of view. And therefore, when anybody suggests that individual man is not what you thought was an individual, but is in some way united with, grounded in the totality, then if you're this kind of rugged individualist, you mix up your vocabulary and you call the totality the collective. Now, the collective and the totality are two completely different things. The idea of collectivism is based on individualism. It's the idea that the society of mankind and the physical environment beyond it is a collection with nothing of the kind. That's the idea of cosmic flotsam and jetsam that all floated together into a collection. And that's the obverse of individualism. You know, American individualism is the same philosophy as Marxist collectivism, seen from the other side, because they're both based on the same erroneous sensation of individuality. Now, what people don't understand is that a complex and interesting personality is not a matter of being isolated. It's a matter of being deeply connected with and aware of one's relationship to the whole surrounding cosmos. Let's suppose that I'm preparing to make a date with some lady, and she's such an individualist that her thoughts are only occupied with herself. She never thinks about anything that isn't herself. But she's an awful bore. She has nothing to say. She's not interested in any books, in any landscapes, in any works of art, in any literature, in any other people. She's a total bore. But the more, on the other hand, she would be interested in all those things that are supposed to be not herself, the more of a colorful personality she becomes. So the rule is to get away, you see, from these ideas of the individual as finding his individuality and uniqueness through independence, but rather finding his individuality and uniqueness through being related. Because you see, that's what makes it. Look at the word relation from another point of view when we talk about our friends and relations. Supposing I come across some individual who I can't make out what kind of a thing he is. I can't make out where he came from. His accent isn't American, it isn't British. It isn't particularly Middle Western. It certainly doesn't have the overtones of New York or New England. He just talks flat. And as to his style of clothing, it's utterly nondescript. Well, I think this is pretty much of a bore. What I like to see in an individuality, in a physical individual, is ways that I can relate him to his ancestry. That he has this little subtle accent, or this mannerism, or this eccentricity, or whatever it is, that connects him with a great background, you see? But it's his connection with his background that makes him so significant. If I can't see that connection, he becomes uninteresting. So, there is no thought in this approach to devalue the individual. What really does devalue the individual is any kind of religious or political philosophy that overstresses his isolation. And this is something that Californians in particular need to take note of. And because many people feel, you see, that the development of technology and of centralized government is a direct threat to the value of personality. Well, in some ways it is. But that is only because technology is being developed by personalities who don't understand what personality is. They're working on the old individualist - collectivist point of view. They're the same. So then, you see, this is the illusion created that the individual is operating all by himself, that actions and thoughts and deeds proceed solely from inside his skin, so that we can say, there's where it started. You see? Well, that's the game of praising and blaming. The game of who started it, who can we give candy to, who can we bang on the head. In other words, somebody has to be it. As in The Farmer in the Dell, you know, and finally we get the end, the cheese stands alone, the cheese stands alone. Hi, over there, the cheese stands alone. Well, why? Who started it? The group. Well, another fear about this is that it absolves people of responsibility if they see through the illusion of separateness. No philosophy of history has really succeeded in making anybody more or less responsible. In other words, let's say that you are a Christian, a Catholic of the old-fashioned medieval type, who believes that you've got an individual soul with free will, and that you're under responsibility to God to obey His law, and that if you don't, the most disastrous consequences imaginable will befall you. You will fry in hell forever. There's no evidence whatsoever that believing in that made people any more virtuous than they are today. None at all. Indeed, clergy who believed in all this owned whorehouses and all kinds of things. They were just as contemptuous of law and order as anybody could be now. And part of the reason was, of course, that the threat of hell was an unimaginable penalty like the H-bomb. It's just too big to think about. And really brings justice into disrespect because it uses such crude and clumsy methods. You know, it's like using a steam hammer to drive in tacks. Responsibility is a thing like a nice face, which you either have or haven't. Certain backgrounds, certain interests, certain awarenesses of relationship create responsibility in some human beings. And they live that way not because they are giving themselves sermons and telling themselves all the time that they ought to be responsible. It's because they're intelligent enough to see that being responsible makes things very much easier for everybody all around. That's all there is to it. And of course that's all is a big all. But you won't, what I'm saying is, the people who are frightened, the people who other people will abandon responsibility, never did have any way of thinking that would guarantee that people would be responsible. There is no such guarantee. If there were, we should be automata. Now, I want to switch to another aspect of illusion. The quickness of the hand deceives the eye. And that is, of course, the great illusion of what we call matter. Density, impenetrability, opacity. I find it hard to talk about the illusion of matter because I'm a materialist. That is to say, I like material. And though I may seem to you to be quite self-contradictory. For example, a wine should have body. Pure alcohol doesn't.
No. I can say